Hey everyone, welcome back to Chipstock Roadshow, Chipstock Investor. We are here one last time on the road to talk about something that we think is very important, and it's infinite scalability. I feel like that word gets thrown around a lot. I've said it before.
As have I.
Yeah, I think we both said it, and we're going to talk about what infinite scalability means. Why is software said to be infinitely scalable? And is that actually true? And then we'll also discuss why are chips being compared to the new oil? And we'll discuss whether or not we agree with that statement and why. We have a very interesting episode coming up. Stay tuned till the end. Hit that subscribe button. Nick, why is this an important discussion?
As investors, we should all embrace nuance. It can be very easy to just draw comparisons to the past. And sometimes that's very helpful to understand where we're at and help inform our investment decisions. But it can also be a crutch that ultimately hinders our progress in learning and understanding the world and how it works, and thus affect our investment decisions, sometimes not for the better, but for the worse. I think let's first talk about this phrase that chips are the new oil, which has been popularized even in some very good books, but I strongly disagree. I think we've mentioned this in past videos, but we haven't provided an in-depth explanation as to why.
One of the reasons we decided to make an episode about this is because we had a video comparing several indices, QQQ and VGT, which are tech-based or software-based indices, versus SOXX, a semiconductor ETF. And we had some comments about the reason that these two indices, VGT and QQQ, did not perform as well as SOX, or the semiconductor ETF, is because the software companies that were in those indices were not good choices. Is that the only reason that those indices did not perform as well as the semiconductor industry?
Yeah, and this was the video where we did our 1-year review of the Chipstock Investor channel. So if you missed that, link to that here so you can see what we're talking about. But I'd point out, Kasey, actually, in this comparison, we just went back basically a decade and showed the very, very, very large outperformance of SOXX, SOX index, over QQQ and VGT, Vanguard Information Technology ETF, which is the one that we have owned for a long time. And one comment in particular said, this is just the last decade that this happened. Semiconductors are like oil. They're cyclical in nature. This is a simplistic comparison. But actually, if you go back to the inception date of these ETFs, which basically goes back to the early 2000s in the wake of the dot-com bubble, that's as far back as we can go, you actually see semiconductors continue to outperform software and the IT industry overall. I think we'd argue this is not a simplistic comparison. Semiconductors are not like oil. It's not that simple. There's a reason why these businesses are not just slightly outperforming the software companies that run atop of the semiconductors. They're absolutely obliterating returns of software companies, the so-called infinitely scalable businesses that we've been, I'd say, indoctrinated to believe are the best businesses in the world over the course of the 2010s and early 2020s.
Just for some clarification, all industries are supply and demand driven, including semiconductors and even software. Maybe software just takes a longer time to get through the cycle, right?
Absolutely. So rather than comparing chips to the new oil, I think we drew up this comparison of the old economy to the new economy. Again, this is, I think, overly simplistic, but maybe a good starting point to just kind of wrap your mind around what is unfolding here, what has been unfolding here over the last 2 or 3 decades. So if you think about the existing economy that's very well established and very tangible in the minds of everyone, let's say you have oil, fossil fuels, petrochemicals, et cetera. That's a base layer that provides the power, the energy that powers everything on top of it. Second, you have infrastructure. So let's think of that like, roads, highways, freeways, transport that uses that infrastructure. And then on top of that, you have goods and services that utilize that infrastructure and which are powered by the energy layer below it to move goods and services around an economy. Now let's draw a comparison of that to this new, let's say, digital economy. We actually don't think of chips as being the new oil, the new energy and petrochemicals. We actually think of data, digital information, as being the base layer that powers everything. Massive amounts of information are getting poured into the IT sector, and it's a commodity. It's an absolute commodity. That doesn't mean it's simple, but there's a lot of it. And that is what powers everything that comes on top of it. So that's where we see chips as being the middle layer, the actual infrastructure, the things that build the internet, that build the data centers, that build PCs and smartphones and so on and so forth, the things that are powered by the energy below it and help move the information around. And then the top layer, software, the services that are being moved around this infrastructure and powered by the data. That's, again, maybe very simplistic, but that's how we think of it. So we don't think chips are the new oil because they're not a base level commodity per se. It's something that has to be manufactured, much like old infrastructure back in the day also had to be engineered and manufactured.
Okay, let's move on to the infinitely scalable statement that we made earlier. So by contrast, software is what's called infinitely scalable. And there are reasons that software is infinitely scalable. It can be sold to customers in perpetuity. A perfect example of this is Microsoft Office 365. Most of the tools are rarely used by everyday users, but Microsoft is still collecting the sale anyways. They get that $7.31 from me, even though I only use Excel. That was the beauty of the advent of cloud computing and subscriptions. The second reason it's infinitely scalable is new software can be made and distributed to existing customers, creating that infinite land and expand potential.
Yeah, and you can see an example of this. We just discussed Cadence Design Systems in its recent push into molecular simulation and drug discovery, development, and optimization. Put very simply, they're taking what they already do very, very well in chip and computing system design, and now extending that to the biotech and big pharma industry. Another reason it's infinitely scalable. You can sell as many times as you can find a customer with a need. Now, Kasey, this is often why software is called an infinitely scalable business model, and it shows up in gross profit margins, which is revenue minus the cost to make the product divided by revenue. And oftentimes these software business see gross profit margins of 70, 80, even 90% because of this infinitely scalable feature. You make the software once, and then you can just keep selling it or keep collecting the subscription on it for as long as you can keep the customer captive in your software suite. It's interesting. I actually would say there are some comparisons here, again, to the old established economy. And again, just looking at that hierarchy of the old economy, you could say goods and services are also infinitely scalable. How many times do y'all keep going back to Walmart or Costco, keep buying the same thing over and over and over again? You could say that top layer hierarchy of the economy is the big, infinitely scalable piece of that economy. Software fills that same role, but maybe on steroids a bit though, because it can be really, really cheap. But here's where things get interesting, because just like in the old traditional economy, this software being infinitely scalable is in reality only a theoretical exercise, right, Kasey?
There's multiple reasons why. First of all, software has low barriers to entry. It's cheap to start coding a competing service. And with the advent of low code and no code, you might even be able to find software in parts and pieces for sale that you can quickly patch together and make your own software solution. And since software is infinitely scalable, it's easy to justify charging a lower price than a competitor. Hardware manufacturing is still mind-bogglingly complex and ludicrously expensive, and only getting more complex and expensive each year.
Right. Which is a big reason why we think chips have been outperforming software stocks over the course of the last 20, 30 years. The barriers to entry are very, very high, and the returns on investment much more predictable for semiconductor stocks than they have been for software stocks for some of the reasons you just said, Kasey.
And based on those low barriers to entry in software, this really helps fuel those runaway stock-based compensation expenses, because you don't want a star engineer to take their talent elsewhere or form a new startup of their own.
Yeah, Kasey, this is a debate that actually is not new. I think a lot of investors became aware of it during the bear market of 2022, but stock-based compensation has been controversial for many decades. You actually put a really great history lesson together on stock-based compensation. Guess where it got its really big start? In the semiconductor industry, all the way back in the 1950s. Okay, but I want to mention here, we've recently watched the original Jurassic Park movie, and this is one of those fantastic movies where it's not really a dinosaur movie. It's actually maybe a great example of a movie about businesses and business structure and business ethics. Why did Jurassic Park go wrong? One of the big reasons is Dennis Nedry felt like he was not being fairly compensated for his talent. So he was going to take some of the IP from Jurassic Park and take it to a competitor and get paid. So this is why a lot of software companies shell out lots of stock-based compensation expense. They do not want their star engineers taking their trade secrets elsewhere. Maybe just a fun little bit here about Jurassic Park. It's been a while since you've seen the original, which is way, way better than the new trilogy anyways, maybe watch it in the light of this stock-based compensation conversation. It's enlightening.
However, this is not a movie review show. So one more piece of information on software. It's not generally a patentable item versus semiconductors, which are, in fact, patentable.
Yeah, another reason why there are some very high barriers to entry for semiconductors and thus far more consistent expected returns on investment versus software.
It's interesting to see a lot of software companies, a lot of big software companies have been grinding it out for years. They have created a very large moat for their business. And now, since they've done that, they're starting to get into the hardware side of business. I'm thinking about, I know Google and Meta aren't exactly software companies. Amazon is not exactly a software company, but these are companies that are now getting involved in creating their own chips.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to point out, Kasey, because, when they got their start, all three of those businesses, some of the most successful investments ever of all time, Amazon, Meta, Google, they all started out as just a simple software service. But to increase their moat, as you said, all of them have gotten into IT infrastructure, that middle layer, again, of the hierarchy of the new economy, to make sure that they're not easily disrupted by a bunch of software upstarts. And now, as they continue to mature, you see all three of these companies and others in the IT industry try to get more into chips and make the best use they can possible with their data, their oil, their new oil, by custom designing their own chips. This fulfills two reasons and makes them harder to disrupt. And I think also, in addition to that, again, Kasey, really, really great and predictable returns on investment by designing your own semiconductors.
So are software companies the best investment ever?
We don't think so. We don't think they're actually infinitely scalable. We think that's a superlative that should be expunged from investors' minds. We think businesses that do both, that do designs with chips and IT infrastructure paired with software, are the best investments.
That's a wrap for us at Chipstock Investor. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Don't miss a video. Make sure your notifications are enabled. And if you feel like leaving us a tip, the link is in the description. See y'all soon.